Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host, Maqbool, with you at PTV World. In today's show, we're going to be taking a look at our fight against terrorism and, of course, something that has been reiterated a number of times by the government, including the Prime Minister, that has spoken about it also with reference to zero tolerance against terrorist activities in Pakistan. And, of course, this is coming in after the attack that we have seen in Barkhan. And this is, of course, coming just days after a number of coal miners were also attacked. The important, of course, in terms of the rise in terrorist activity, particularly in KB and Balochistan, is something that emanates from safe havens being provided in Afghanistan. And that has been endorsed by a very recent UN Security Council report as well, saying that that holds a larger threat to the region. This is something reiterated by the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Mr. Ishaq Dar, as well, to the UN Secretary General in a meeting with reference to what is going on within the region and, of course, our fight against terrorism, and also asking for facilitation from the UN with reference to Pakistan's fight in combating terrorism, both within and from Afghanistan. And then, of course, the ways in which that has impacted Pakistan, with more than 600 attacks that have been reported by the UN itself. This is, of course, very, very integral to Pakistan's own fight and our national action plan in this regard, in the way that we want to move forward with cohesion and unity, but also at the same time in terms of border management and in the way that Pakistan actually wants to facilitate the development and peaceful stability of Afghanistan, and then, of course, engage with the Afghan Taliban regime in Kabul for the ways in which this can be taken very, very seriously, and how this remains a bone of contention in the relationship, and to resolve that and move forward in protecting Pakistan and, of course, the entire region. So that is going to be our focus in the show today, in terms of understanding Pakistan's own efforts in this regard, what the UN can possibly do, and what other sort of international cooperation avenues can be looked at when we talk about the fight against terrorism, particularly that emanating from Afghanistan. For this and more, as always, in the studios, I have been joined by senior analyst Farrukh Pitafi and Raja Faisal, and we've been joined by Dr. Jamil Khan, the former ambassador online. Thank you very much, Dr. Jamil, for joining us and being a part of the discussion. And I'm going to be starting with you with reference to the ways in which we have been talking about Pakistan's fight against terrorism, particularly when we talk about safe havens in Afghanistan. The kind of engagement in terms of diplomatic channels and measures has been taken a number of times with the Afghan Taliban regime, but we haven't had success in terms of the ways in which we want this reassurance to be there. In fact, the UN report also talks about the financial and operational support that is being given to terrorist organizations, including the TTP in Afghanistan. So I want your take now in terms of what we see in light of this report, in light of what Pakistan has been saying for quite some time now, the ways in which this can be engaged, and how then what Mr. Ishaq Dar has also reiterated, the UN can actually play its role in this regard.
Once we ask for the external collaboration and help, such as United Nations, and United Nations needs the other member states, how do they collaborate with a state which is being attacked by use of a soil of another state, in this case, Afghanistan. Now, so this has its international legal connotation. The second aspect of it is the internal matter. Now, the member state can always ask that the Pakistan, for its own internal security, what policies do we have? And we do have a policy. Our basic policy to address the counterterrorism is the National Action Plan. And every month, or very frequently, the National Action Plan, Apex Committee meeting, it takes from time to time. It takes place at all levels, at the provincial level as well as at the federal level. I'll quickly touch upon on that. That is the NAB 14 point. Initially, it was 21 point, and the entire nation had given the mandate to the government of that time and then subsequent government that they should use all measures and all resources available at the government disposal under those 21 points. Later on, it was reduced to 14 points because rest of the other points were covered and implemented. Now, the points which were left is the two part of this National Action Plan, and I'm quickly switching over to the international aspect of it. And the National Action Plan, because the international players would definitely have an eye that what internally Pakistan is doing. Pakistan is doing a lot. We've been recognized in our kinetic domain. In our kinetic domain, we've been able to implement, that is the militancy to its greater extent. We've been able to implement a spread of terrorism in terms of media, electronic, print, and all that. So these are the kinetic measures and effective measures we have taken. Some of the religious, sectarian, and those outfits choking terror financing. So there is, I can go on with all the 14 points. But then the other one is the non-kinetic domain. And non-kinetic domain, counterterrorism, that is one thing which has its links with the other countries such as Afghanistan, as well as some additional resources are required to address this non-kinetic thing, that such as the industrialization, such as the development, such as the capacity development, and so on and so forth. So this is what Mr. Dar, our Deputy Prime Minister, and the Foreign Minister, he mentioned to the Secretary General, and also he made a statement there. Now, coming straight on this point, it's the responsibility of the member state. It means that's where our foreign minister and deputy prime minister asked the the Nations intervention. Article 1 of the United Nations, it says that the United Nations has to maintain the international peace and security, including threat posed by terrorism. So that's a general thing. And then Article 2, sub-article 4, that also revolve around some of the points that the other states should not really, the terrorism should not emanate from the soil of other states. Then the implementation clause, which our deputy prime minister and the foreign minister perhaps had in his mind, and that implementation clause is chapter 7 of from Article 39 to 51, which means that we are asking the United Nations that please do your obligation, and the Security Council should pass some resolution in which the assistance should be given to Pakistan, and also some of the harsh measures taken against Afghanistan because they have not been able to stop or prevent the people using their soil, particularly TTP and ISIS, which are carrying out and conducting so many operations. And he has given the list of those operations also, which is, and then there are Security Council resolutions where like 1373 and Security Council resolution, there are other resolution 1267. So implementation of those are also responsibility of international community and United Nations. And that's where our foreign minister was emphasizing on that. But UN Counterterrorism Committee has been formed about a decade ago, and that Counterterrorism Committee, its responsibility is to monitor and the implementation of the major measure and find out the support to the state. And that is where we are asking that we need a support to us, and what kind of a support. It could be many kinds of support. It could be support through the budgetary or through the funding, and it could be support through the asserting the pressure on the state which is not being able to prevent the groups which are conducting terrorism in on our soil. So these are those fundamental points which Pakistan Foreign Office, I guess, would do it as a follow up. Now it's not a something normal that the more than 2,500 facilities in Pakistan only in 2024 have been attacked, and the cross-border terrorism has increased. It's 66% last year. So that means that there is definitely some either connivance or lose control, and connivance seems to be more appropriate in this case. And therefore, the world community has to step in. And why they have to step in? Because today, if it is not controlled, this is what Mr. Dar has mentioned, that it's going to spread. It's going to spread in the region and then beyond the region. And that's where the Security Council had already mentioned, and that is where Taliban had once had they had signed the Doha Agreement with United States. They had taken this responsibility. They had given this undertaking that their soil would be not be used by any terrorist group. There are 20 terrorist groups at this point in time, and that has been mentioned in the Security Council monitoring team latest report. So out of those 20 groups, the two major groups, as a matter of fact, the most concerning thing for Pakistan is that TTP has started leading some of these groups, including ISIS, which is Khorasan. So Daesh. So that has started becoming, and that is a threat to the so many nations of the world, and I think around the globe. And the fighters, they are ever increasing. TTP fighters, the ISIS, which is Daesh fighters, ever increasing. So why the question, bigger question, which I'm sure Mr. Dar has raised, and we've been raising it from our foreign office, and that is why Taliban is showing inaction, right? Taliban otherwise has started asserting a very good control over it. Is this inaction because of their structure, because of the resources, or it is because of something else? I think the second part seems to be more plausible here because wherever they wanted to control, they have controlled that. So, in this context, the Security Council or the United Nations has its own funding, where Mr. Dar has mentioned that Pakistan needs some support because these are the international laws, these are the international community's responsibilities, and all those have give cited some of the articles and some of the provisions I've cited. So that is where the U.S. funding, there about I think over 184 million U.S. funding to address the terrorism for the counter-terrorism purposes, and Pakistan is the worst affected. In fact, there are very few countries which are affected like this, and it's Somalia, it's Nigeria, it's Afghanistan, it's Pakistan. Afghanistan, it's within their own territory. So because of which, unless we are given some support, both the Security Council support as well as the support from the funding point of view, and once the Security Council and the United Nations they get activated on this, they would definitely, I'm sure, they would think of implementing. And with the Trump coming in the United States, which has a very significant influence on United Nations because they are the one, they are putting about 35% of the United Nations budget. So they have the leverage, and the United States is also quite concerned because United States is number one country which has a budget allocation of about $30 billion to address the counterterrorism. It's only for the assistance purposes.
Right.
And I'm sure that at subsequent stages, Pakistan can always think of that. Pakistan has urged the United Nations to enforce sanction now and increase pressure on Taliban. I think we should have done both vertical approach and the horizontal approach, means that we should have engaged Taliban, that we've been trying to help you out in removing sanction, but at the same time, now this is what is happening, and Pakistan is left with no choice, and the world is also thinking about it.
Right,
So
absolutely.
these are
And
the
let's explore that further because, Faisal, we've seen that especially in the aftermath of the US troop withdrawal, there was a lot of concern with reference to the humanitarian crises as well, and the kind of situation in Afghanistan. And while that may be true, of course, it is very, very integral and important to safeguard Pakistan's own borders, and that, of course, is a priority and a national interest. But I want your take in terms of the kind of measures that Dr. Jamil was referring to, particularly in terms of increase of sanctions or the role that the US can play, or the importance of the Doha Accord in the current situation, where we stand today at this moment in time, and in the ways that we have seen since the US troop withdrawal, the Afghan Taliban regime engage with different countries around the world, and then of course also in the ways that it has shown perhaps an incapability or a lack of willingness to deal with these terrorist organizations, and then, of course, outrightly supporting them as per the UN report as well. In that aspect, what can we do to call on the United Nations or the US, or give reference to the Doha Accord to deal with the ways that we want our current situation to be dealt with? How relevant will that be?
Yes, and obviously when we talk about where does Pakistan stand, Pakistan is standing where it was standing before. Of course, we have been fighting this menace, fighting war against terrorism since more than 20 years, and we kept on fighting this very war even after the Afghan Taliban took over Kabul, and all of the other countries who have been present in there, obviously all of them, they left Afghanistan. Their withdrawal was just like a flash flooding. Everyone simply got out of there and they never looked back, and here we are fighting still against that menace. And we were the ones who were considered as once considered as non-NATO important ally, and now of course Pakistan, being that non-NATO ally, still is fighting against the terrorism, whereas NATO's and Americans and all of the other allies, they left Afghanistan, and the mess which they created, that is still being obviously Pakistan is recovering against it, and Pakistan is fighting against it. When we talk about how Afghan Taliban are thinking about it, number one, of course they made a pledge, and they pledged that they will never allow their land to be used against any of the neighboring countries for terrorism purposes. Here they are, they didn't do anything, and sometimes I believe intentionally they don't do anything. Reason being, in this whole mess they see an opportunity for themselves. Why I say this? Because if we talk about different stakeholders, of course they know that there are important countries around them, and they can create a deterrence against all of the other countries, and they can create an opportunity for the adversaries of them important countries around them. When it comes to Pakistan, of course they want to keep TTP, they want to keep BLA, they want to keep BLF, and they want to keep ISIS Khorasan, because they believe that all of these, they are a sort of deterrence for Pakistan, and they can attract countries like India, they can attract money from there, and that is why they are keeping them. And when we talk about ETIM, everyone knows that ETIM is present in there, ISIS Khorasan is there as well, which is a kind of deterrence for China. They want to keep them. Why? Because China has adversaries like other countries like Japan and Quad countries like India. Of course, they are attracting them to, of course, keep these two as a stake, and that stake can always be used against any other country, and they are attracting dollars with that. And maybe there are many other avenues that can be, of course, dealt with. Same like Iran. Iran, of course, everyone knows that BLF and BLA as well, both of them, they are active in Iran as well, and in that context, of course, they are nibbing them with this kind of deterrence. Eventually, what we see is that Afghan Taliban intentionally maybe are not doing anything against all of these organizations, terrorist organizations. The sole reason one considers is that as we see them right now, in case of going to Japan with the obviously recommendations of Indians as a delegation. Their delegation was in Japan day before yesterday, and what does it represent? It represents that of course they are going elsewhere, and they are not doing the immediate job which they are supposed to do. And when it comes to Pakistan, remember Sana, when the Taliban took over Kabul, right after that there was only one country in the world that was holding conference after conference in Pakistan to attract the humanitarian aid from whole world to, of course, support the people of Afghanistan, because at that time we even kept on highlighting that there are dire situations in Afghanistan, and there are, of course, the weather is very was playing the crucial role. And at that time, of course, Pakistan highlighted again and again that their due share of their money that was harboring elsewhere in the other countries, that should be, of course, returned to the Afghan Taliban. And we were doing this only because of one reason, that was to, of course, to help Afghanistan recover from the humanitarian crisis they had at that time. Remember, they had floods as well, and even during that time, Pakistan played a positive role, being an excellent neighbor to Afghanistan. But what happens later on? Of course, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, one wonders how many factions they have within themselves. Of course, when it comes to Kandahar group or Kabul group and Jalalabad group and Haqqani networks, how many they have, don't know, and who's aligned where, don't know, and who's having what kind of leverage within themselves, don't know. And this is the sort of administration we are having in the country next door to us, who's looking after their foreign affairs preferences when it comes to where to go to ask for what, and in favor for asking whatever, what favors they are extending to them. These all things are need to be probed by United Nations, and I must say here that United Nations, it should form a special committee to look after all of these aspects. Whatever the news were coming out from Afghanistan, especially related to Afghan Taliban's connections with other countries, on what terms them connections were, and if they were attracting some kind of investments within their country, what leverage they are providing to somebody in return to that. And these sort of all of the problems, they need to be probed, and United Nations, as they have come up with this report, now they have to do something about it, because Pakistan is still fighting against the same menace they have been fighting for 20 years, and Pakistan is still standing where Pakistan should have been standing in terms of a very responsible country, where we are trying to make sure that our neighboring Afghanistan not only affects us, but it does not affect the whole world like it used to do previously before 9/11. And we are the most responsible country right now. Rest of the world, they need to be responsible enough, and United Nations must ensure that the powerful countries of the world and members of the Security Council, they are responsible enough in this context that this menace which is continuously brewing in our next door should be dealt with.
Right, absolutely. And Farrukh, I want your perspective on that, because while we talk about what the United Nations should be doing, or of course seeking for help or facilitation from the United Nations, we've seen historically and otherwise as well that perhaps the UN Security Council resolutions themselves are not very binding, don't have consequence, that there are violations all over the world without any action being taken against the countries. And so in terms of the situation in Afghanistan, what can the UN possibly do, and how real will that expectation be in terms of then doing anything about the current situation, and then whether or not Pakistan should then be looking towards the UN to solve the matter in any perspective?
Right. Thank you very much, Sana, because your question was so comprehensive. I had this impression that that UN can hardly do anything, right? And that is, but before that, and of course I'm going to talk about UN twice in this intervention that I have. Faisal was talking about 3 years later, after whatever happened, or 4 years later. My question to everybody is, did you not see this coming? If you did not, were you not listening? I was sitting next to everybody. I was sitting on air here, telling you this is exactly what is going to happen. At that time, what happened, right? Why is it that people don't listen? If they don't, then can they complain now? Now, regarding UN and of course the statement on which we are actually basing this discussion, Isaac Dar Saab is Pakistan's foreign minister. He is also Pakistan's deputy prime minister, right? Pakistan is a nation state and a member of UN. And because all these modalities exist and he is at the UN, he is bound to say this, and he is bound to actually ask for UN's help. And at this moment, luckily or unluckily, we have a seat on the table at the UNSC also. Why do I say unluckily? Because, Sana, there are 3 questions that I need answers for, whenever we can find that. Number one, when Doha agreement was actually, or Doha talks were taking place, at that time we know who was calling shots in Pakistan. At that time, why was it that Pakistan did not ask that other stakeholders in Afghanistan or a neighbor like Pakistan be made a party to discussion? We were celebrating that we have a role, but we did not actually ask for formalization of that role. So today when I go to Afghan Taliban and I say that according to Doha agreement you are supposed to do this or that, they answer us that you are not even party to that, we are not answerable to you, right? The second question, Sana, is that when it comes to the situation at that time, amazingly, Pakistan can say whatever it wants, Pakistan can look towards UN, but that was the time when UN mattered, because at that time there was a government which in America which attached a lot of importance to UN. And something very strange happens. It is almost like a hitman's job in Pakistan, that somebody at that time decided that there is going to be some kind of, why is Pakistan member of UNSC today? At that time there was another country that was member of the UNSC, and it was called India. India was at such a crucial position that it managed to shut Pakistan out. Pakistan's permanent representative would speak to media that we are not being given a seat on the table, right? And we are a crucial stakeholder. At that time, whosoever this hitman was decided that there is going to be an agreement between India and Pakistan. Pakistan will vote for India, and India gets to the table, and then later on Pakistan also gets selected. Pakistan was scheduled to actually take the seat at a time when there were elections in the US, and after that what happens, Sana, the fact is that UN itself is struggling for its own survival. UN by domicile is a New Yorker. It is based in New York City, right? And so is the American president. An American president actually, and it seems that today UN has less influence in the world affair than Elon Musk's Starlink. Perhaps that can actually help you man the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the third thing is, Sana, after all these settlements were done, Afghan Taliban took over, whatever happened, Pakistan played a crucial role. But at that time, suddenly, what happens is that Pakistan actually removes all the safeguards it had in the bordering provinces of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan. Pickets were removed. And then these people, these TTP people were allowed to come back. Question is it not a job of a hitman? And if there was such a hitman who was actually hitting at Pakistan's permanent interest, why is there no accountability, no discussion on these matters? So today, if you ask UN, UN is a great body, but UN is as strong or as weak as its members. And given the fact that at this moment it seems that there are huffy members like India and Israel who cannot find a space, a permanent space at the UNSC, and that's why they actively undermine it. On the other side, there is US which thinks that UN is a liability. With that kind of a state of affairs, UN has no capacity to influence whatever is happening. The world order, Sana, keeps on shifting very quickly. And this has been happening since the end of Cold War. And unfortunately, despite being such a crucial partner in the, first of all, when you talk about the Cold War, Pakistan played such a great role, but then we could not capitalize on our gains. Then in the war on terror, once again, Pakistan was the linchpin. We sacrificed so much that we brought the war to our own land, and yet we could not. So there must be something wrong, and it must be some hitmen who are part of your permanent tapestry. who come and go, but who damage it, and then they actually leave the seeds around to germinate into even bigger hitmen. So the question is, if we are serious about UN actually conducting probe, as my brother was saying, if we are serious about US, and by the way, US is going to investigate, and Pete Hexet, we are looking at you, what exactly you can do will be great for everybody, because we need to know what happened in Afghanistan. How did Ashraf Ghani just disappeared, leaving no trace? If that is happening, shouldn't we be conducting equal sort of, investigation with proper punishment for people who might have destroyed the country?
Absolutely. And Dr. Jamil, I want your perspective on that as well in terms of accountability at home, because there is, of course, a lot of conversation with what we expect from the international community and what we can expect from the UN, or what we need in terms of action to be taken by countries outside of the region as well. But in terms of what Pakistan needs to do inside its borders, and in terms of looking at accountability and bringing people to task, there is, of course, also those who have been the supporters of these terrorist organizations, or who have enabled their presence in the country. And so I want your take on what needs to be done in that regard, and what action plan can then be put forward so that we're not in that position again.
In fact, Pakistan is quite good, and it has been recognized by so many nations of the world, including United Nations, our contribution towards fight against terrorism. And in regard to this counterterrorism actions, yes, as I was mentioning in the first segment of our discussion, we have really been figuring out very well, and some of the examples which we have set up in our kinetic operations and kinetic way of dealing with the terrorism is cited, and so many countries of the world are quite cognizant of it, and they do admire and admit that. But as I said, the non-kinetic the measures which is enunciated in our national action plan, that somehow is lacking, and that is lacking mostly because of the scarce resources. What we have, we don't have that much of resources in terms of funding, in terms of other resources to address those non-kinetic measures. And therefore, as I was mentioning, that our Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Mr. Dar, had really had this discussion and made this statement about our role as in the Afghan war, and then in fact everything emanates from there. Before Afghan war, we did not have this problem of terrorism, particularly after the culmination of the Afghan war. I would cite here Hillary Clinton while she was being testified in front of the Foreign Relations Committee. She admitted, and she is on the video available on the net. And she said that, Pakistan, we just left them high and dry. We washed our hand and came back from Pakistan without rehabilitating those people who were fighting against the Soviet Union. So a story basically starts from there. And government of that time could not really rehabilitate those people who could have turned into what is happening now as a terrorist, and fighting or conducting the operations, terrorist operations, or creating a terrorism in our country. And they have been also playing in the hands of the other countries such as India. So there's multiple factors. BLA is another factor. They have a different dimension of the whole terrorism. So we are now fighting on a multiple fronts. One is the TTP, but both these ideology, the BLA ideology and the TTP ideology, and the motivation and the support comes from the same soil, and that is Afghanistan. And therefore, we are making this noise about Afghanistan soil. About the Doha agreement, and we were not included in that at that time. We did facilitate, but we were not, we could not participate for a variety of reasons. But once the Doha agreement was signed and implemented afterward, it was almost endorsed, because the same clauses of Doha agreements were reflected in August, September 2021 or 22 by the Security Council resolution. And therefore, it becomes, and the United Nations takes the ownership of some of the clauses, such as Afghanistan soil, which we were mentioning, and we were discussing. All three of us, we were discussing about that how Afghan Taliban have not been able to control and have not been able to willing to perhaps to control that and TTP. In fact, on these channels, including your channel, once this Doha agreement was finalized and implemented, and at that time, as Taliban took over, I mentioned at that time that look, about 800 TTP terrorists who were involved in Pakistan conducting various terrorist acts, particularly the army school. Uh, they we requested them to hand it over to us because they had the blood on their hand. But at that time, Taliban released them and did not hand them over. That would have been a very good red flag for Pakistan to see the sentiments of Afghan Taliban. Were they compelled to do that? Were they not willing to do that? Were they not having the infrastructure to implement that? Many factors. And my argument is mostly that the TTP or any or other members of the 20 terrorist groups, most of them have been fighting with the current Taliban regime shoulder to shoulder against Soviet Union, and they have their own affiliations, they have their own comradeship, so therefore, it becomes very hard for Afghan Taliban. But now there is another swing to it, and there is another dimension to it that the Afghan Taliban are now perhaps also trying to have a leverage of all these groups, what they are acting and reacting against other countries. So, because Taliban probably are thinking to have their say before they are able to control. So there are various hypotheses about it, but I think at the end of the day, Taliban have to really implement it because, as I was saying, that the Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, if it's implemented, yes, Security Council people have started losing trust. Why they have started losing trust? Not because of the Security Council Secretariat. I've served United Nations more than 9.5 years, almost 10 years, and they have two components. One component is it's the normal secretariat, it's the civil servants of United Nations, they are doing their job. But it's a Security Council, they are quite polarized, they are quite politicized, and therefore, because of the veto power. And what glaring example I can give you more than the Gaza issues and more than the Kashmir issue
Exactly.
dispute, where so many resolutions have been passed and
Absolutely.
um, the,
Absolutely. There's no real operational power or ability in terms of actually binding countries. And I understand that, Dr. Jamil, of course, the UN has its own merits as well in peacekeeping and other areas. But I also want your take in terms of when we talk about the Afghan Taliban regime. Of course, since the US troop withdrawal, there was, of course, a lot of concern in terms of the reassurances that were given as to what is going to be the future of Afghanistan like. And of course, unless those reassurances are actually met, there was also a consensus of sorts in terms of the international community not really recognizing the Afghan Taliban regime as a sovereign government. While that may be so, and while that may still be in place, how real is that in terms of its impact? Because they are the de facto rulers of the country, and there are countries that have been engaging with them, such as India and Japan, as Faisal was mentioning, among others, who continue to engage with the Afghan Taliban regime. And of course, Pakistan has been doing it also in its own accord. But I want your take in terms of understanding what that means for a government or for the regime that is not officially recognized as a sovereign government. But of course, the world is engaging with them because it has to, and at the same time, it is an area or a place of instability and a cause of concern for terrorist activities around the world.
not only that, but Afghanistan is so significant for all the countries around it, and particularly SCO countries. Once the world is moving from global west to global south. So in that context, Afghanistan becomes very pivotal country. But coming back to that point of Afghan Taliban and their administration of the country, yes, they are the group in government, and they are the one they are running the country. There is no denial of the fact, and the world is engaging, including Russia, including other Gulf countries and Japan, and so many other countries. They are engaging with them. Why they have not been recognized? Well, there is a chicken and egg situation. The Doha Agreement, which has been endorsed almost by the Security Council, it says that they have to first make sure that their soil is not used for the other countries, and the terrorists do not really are not bred there. But more importantly, the women right, the children right, and so many other aspects, which is in the part two of the Doha Agreement, has not been implemented. So therefore, the world does not remove the sanctions, number one, and number two, that they do not recognize Afghan Taliban regime. But practically, even U.S. United States is sending maximum assistance through the UN to Afghanistan, and even Donald Trump had mentioned that I will withdraw those support from the Afghanistan, means I'll withdraw that financial support to United Nations, which is disseminating the humanitarian. So coming back to your point, yes, Afghan Taliban, they are the one running the government, and the other member states of the United States are engaging with them, but they have the handicap that unless they fulfill the requirements of the Security Council resolution, which was passed in 2021 and 2022, unless they do that, perhaps it would be very hard for those countries to recognize Afghan Taliban. Now, Afghan Taliban have their own concern and have their own argument. They say, well, our $6 billion are frozen, and we are having a very scarce resources. So release our money, recognize us so that we are in a position to improve ourselves, strengthen ourselves, and then we start implementing other aspects. So that is where the entire things is at the stalemate. And I think what is needed from Pakistan side is that Pakistan has been trying. We made some mistakes. We admit that. We've been admitting on air so many times that it's good Taliban, bad Taliban problem, and then we could accede to the pressure of the TTP on the recommendation of Taliban, on the recommendation of certain groups of Taliban, but it didn't really work. So once it didn't work, then that means we have to further enhance our engagement. Now, Taliban or Afghanistan, for that matter, it has such a pivotal role in so far as Pakistan is concerned. What else can we do? 2,600 kilometers of border we have fenced, and still people are crossing the border and conducting this terrorism. So we really have to revisit some of our measures which we have taken. We have to revisit our engagement with Taliban. We have to revisit what we are asking the world and what way that is going to impact our bilateral relation with Afghanistan. So Foreign Office has to do a lot. They have their plate full, and they have to really do hard work. The minister or the
Absolutely, and that
deputy
is what
prime minister.
Pakistan has been doing. Of course, thank you very much, Dr. Jamil Khan, for joining us and being a part of the discussion. Farrukh, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, very quickly, I just wanted to actually talk about transparency. And one thing, I'm going to replug my piece, Behold the Wooden Horse, written on August 7th of the same year as withdrawal. Just look it up, read it, and we people. I had predicted all these things happening, but the second very important thing is, yesterday we were listening to President Trump talking about social security of Americans, and there they found out that they are on their list people aged 369 years old. So that means that it is all fraud or some kind of mistake. The fact is, states deserve their secrets, but only if they can really defend them. So we need transparency on what happened in the past 4 years and who did what.
Right. Thank you, Farrukh. Thank you, Faisal, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Jamil, for being a part of the discussion. That's all that we have from the debate. We'll now see you tomorrow.